papers, and then we will be able to, yeah, and so a lot of the detail will be in those papers, but I'll share a few more snippets, or we will share a few more snippets about the project. First of all, we just wanted to cover what prompted this study. So I look after an internship program for non-clinical health degrees, and Tom is the practice convener for occupational therapy. And both of us, we had some students with a disability on WIL, and they had a really, really bad experience. And so we just got chatting here in the lunchroom, because we both work here at University of Canberra Hospital, and we just came up with this project, and we thought it'd be a really great idea to see if we could apply for the project, and we were really lucky enough to get the money from ACEN. So that's really what started this project. We then asked colleagues that I've worked with before from Edith Cowan Uni and our inclusion area, who are experts in, talking with and helping students with disability. So that's really what prompted us. And we think that's important, as that sort of underpinned this study. I'm going to cover a little bit of the background, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We want to leave that to the studies that we looked at. The two sort of acts, the 1992 Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Standards for Education Act 2005, are key legislation relating to disability within the higher education sector, and things that we should always be considering. And when we look at the information in these two documents, in essence, they say it's unlawful for a university to deny or limit a student's access to any benefit provided by an educational authority, and to have curricular components that excludes an individual with a disability in the higher education, that excludes an individual with a disability from participation. Now, as many of you know, disability is one of the 6 equity groups defined by the Higher Education Participation and Partnerships Program. So this really underpins what we were doing, as does the definition that we used for this project. And the definition that we chose to use caused a lot of discussion. We had a lot of discussion within the research group. And what we decided to do was use the definition that was in the 1992 Disability Discrimination Act. Now, we acknowledge that the definition is more of a medical focus than a social focus, as some of the more recent definitions may have. But the Disability Discrimination Act, the Disability Standards for Education, and that definition provided the project with a reference point, because much of what we do is driven by the current legislation, and this allowed us to see if current practices and understandings have deviated from that legislation, or there is a need to deviate or suggest legislative change. That really sort of underpinned what we're doing. Another thing that's worth noting is that the number of students with disability or condition enrolling in university is increasing. Now, AIHW data reports around 6% of students who completed a course in 2019 have a reported disability. So it could be higher if they haven't reported. And students with a disability have lower success rates than those without a disability in completing the course. So that's 82% versus 88%. So it does show that we need to have more things in place. When we look from the WIL perspective, all of us here in the room acknowledge successful WIL requires a collaborative partnership between the stakeholders, so a tripartite relationship, and that with the 3 main stakeholders: the university, the host organisation, and the students. Now, I always talk about host organisation, and to me that refers to all organisation types that provide a WIL experience for all of our students. Now, as you're all also aware, the 3 documents that we've got in the little boxes here are 3 groundbreaking WIL documents that have been presented since 2008. And they also highlight the importance of all stakeholders in WIL. But we also know that in current practice, the stakeholder partnerships are imbalanced. So given our experiences, particularly Tom and I, our discussions and the experiences, the gaps in the WIL provision for students with disability and the importance of the host organisations in providing the actual WIL and the impact this can have on a student's future experience, we wanted to focus our project on the host organisation. We felt that the host organisation didn't have a big say in those stakeholder arrangements, but also were so key and so influential on what actually happened within that will experience itself. So the aims of our project were to explore the challenges and capacity of host organisations to provide a meaningful and appropriate will experience for health students with disability through the perceptions of both the students and will supervisors or the host organisations. But also to develop resources that provide host organisations with the information and tools to effectively host and supervise health students with disability. So our study design, there were 3 components to it. We had the review component that comprised a scoping review, and then while not included in our original submission, but has added a lot of value to our study, is a desktop review of the university will policies and procedures. The second component was an exploration phase, and this is where we conducted host organisation survey and focus groups and interviews with the students to get both of their host organisation and student perspective. And then the final component was the development of the resources, which Tom is going to showcase a little bit later. And all of that then leads to building host organisation capacity to engage students with disability in will. So just going briefly through each of these different the projects that we did. The first was the scoping review, and we used a 3-stage search strategy. I'm just really basic going into this. A search of relevant databases, review of reference lists, hand search of key journals. And we came up with about 1,000 references here. We used, Tom and I and a couple of others from the research group, to use Confidence to search through the articles. And we chose articles published between 2005 and 2022. So the 2005 really aligns with the Disability Standards for Education Act that we've got there. When we searched through all those, we found 21 peer review papers. Sorry, the bell keeps getting me every time. All of the studies, all 21 peer review papers, were really rich with the data, and some were from the perspective of the student, some from the host organisation, and then there were studies who did a mix of host organisation and student perspectives. And what we found were the key themes were the same, regardless of whether it was coming from the host organisation or the student. It's just that it may have been a more positive view from one and a negative view from the other. But the key themes that really stood out across them all were disclosure of disability. And that's around the different views around disclosure between the host organisations or the will supervisors and the students. And the other was that stood out was students with disability really wanted to be seen as individuals. The university, another key theme was the university staff and will supervisor attitudes and training. And it was both students and host organisations or supervisors found that they needed to have more training, university staff and will supervisors. So it was really evident to students that the staff weren't trained well enough to be able to help them on a will experience, or even understanding the legislation, understanding what disability is. Surviving will really came from the perspective of the student, and that was understanding their own disability and its impact on will and how they can use their disability to their advantage, but also how important it was to understand how they fit in the workplace with their disability. And then with both the supervisors and the students was about reasonable accommodations and the positives and negatives and the different views around using it. The other thing that came out in some of those papers was the strengths-based approach. So while the other 3 are more negative, it was this strength-based about adjusting to will to the individual and what needed to be put in place to make sure that there was a successful will for the student. The next study we did was the review of university will policies and procedures. Now, this was a review, a desktop review, if you like, and what we did is we searched all university websites to see what will policies and procedures were publicly available. And the idea behind that was if you were going to a university and you had a disability, you wanted to know more about that university and its policies and procedures. We created a review criteria to analyse each of those will policies and procedures, and that's some of the review criteria, not all, that's included on the screen there. So 39 university websites were searched, and the key themes were around the availability, accessibility and quality of those particular policies and procedures, the consistency and transparency of information. So was there information about accommodations and inherent requirements and the tools that could be available to help students with disability? And the last one theme that came out was when we looked at will and disability together. So searching all of those procedures and policies, and remembering that not all universities have a procedure and policy, they might have one or the other. And whether disability, the word disability or any reference to disability was in those documents. And not all of them had referred to disability or had any information to assist students with disability on will. And we looked at the language and lens, and some of this was in the really quite negative, and I think quite eye-opening when you looked at them, at how negative the language is in these policies and procedures when there is reference to disability. The next one is where we start the exploration phase, and I can talk forever on this, so I'm trying to keep it, you know, within our time limit here. And the first was the host organisations, and we had two components to this this study. First of all, we did an online survey. It had a mix of qualitative and quantitative responses, and the host organisations, or the will supervisors representing the host organisations, had to complete the online survey prior to attending the focus group. And what we did in the focus group was go into more depth about what was in that online survey, and also to see what resources, what information the organisations needed. The participants, as I said, were will supervisors from host organisations that provided will to health students at UC and ECU. So it could be, it didn't matter if they had hosted a student with a disability or not. We wanted to get the perspective of host organisations and will supervisors on both. So there were, on the online survey, 28 completed the survey. With 14 will supervisors, they hadn't supervised a student with a disability, which was totally fine because there was some really great perspectives from them. 9 of the 28 organisations have a will-related policy and or procedure in place for students with a disability. And for the most, it was using their normal procedures or policies for people who work there, employees, sorry. And interesting thing, supervisors were not aware of any university will policies and guidelines. And that also sort of triggered that desktop review that we did. The focus groups, 20 of those 28 who completed the survey were able to attend the scheduled focus groups. And you can see sort of a little trend sort of happening in our themes here. Disclosure or non-disclosure of disability is starting to show up a lot in the things that we were doing. And that really sort of looked at, sorry, I just need my notes there. The non-disclosure of the disability was where host organisations were saying, you know, it is better to know. And Tom will talk a little bit about this when we go to the key findings across the whole study. It was about the student needs and what they felt the student needed. And also a theme was the host organisation's limited capacity to provide will for students with disability. And that also informed what we included in our resources. And there was also the university's responsibilities. So while those who participated in the study felt they had a lot of support from the university, there were also things that they didn't know about, you know, like, you know, the policies that we mentioned before, but also some of the processes, the expectations, those type of things. The next slide has a couple of, and I'll just leave this with you, I think, to read, 2 quotes from the host organisations. The first is one that's about the disclosure, and the second is about the organisation's capacity. Hopefully, is that enough time? Hopefully everyone's been able to read that. So some of the comments we've got are really, really quite sort of powerful. So they're just, as I said, a couple of examples. The next stage we did was an exploration. In the exploration phase was the students and interviewing the students, because we really wanted to see their perspective. And we believe that the student's voice is really important when we look at any aspect around will with students with disability. So students with a disability, and this was specific in terms of participants from a health discipline who had completed will through either the University of Canberra or ECU, were invited to participate in a one-on-one interview. 11 students agreed to participate and were interviewed, and we had a requirement that they didn't have to disclose their disability. We left that up to the student to do that whether they wanted to or not. In this, and the reason why we did the one-on-one interviews was because of the sensitive nature of the topic and some of the information that the students had disclosed to us prior to the interview that they wanted to share with us. The students also found that these interviews were, that there was someone there to listen to them. I think that was one thing that really struck me doing the interviews, in that they didn't feel heard. And this was a really good opportunity for them to feel heard. So it's some of the themes, the 4 main themes that came out was around the will adjustment plans, whether they enabled or hindered their participation. And this, it didn't, these adjustment plans didn't ensure success of the will, but it was also how they were applied and how the adjustment plans or accommodation plans were seen by the host organisations and the students' perception of that. Again, we have disclosure coming up of the disability, and that really depended on whether the student was comfortable and understood their own disability. And that's when they were ready to disclose to the university or the will supervisor. So that was a really important point for them. They documented changes to engaging in will, and they were no different to things that were in the scoping review, even things that were back in 2005. So it shows you we still have a way to go with, trying to address some of these things. And then the students shared with us the support and accommodations that they felt they needed to successfully engage in will, and things that could help the organisations help them successfully engage in will. I'm just going to share with you one student quote. From the interviews. And this was a common quote, particularly for those who were concerned about disclosing, or even people who, while they were disclosing now, felt this way very early on when they were trying to understand their disability. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Tom. He's going to talk about the key findings and share with you our core resources.
Thanks, Tanya. So what we did once we gathered all of that information, we looked at it all and we found 5 common themes. And the first thing that we discovered was that a lot of the policies and procedures throughout the whole process and system is using outdated language. And we feel that was kind of connected back to the original disability legislation of 1992. We know that disability terminology has moved on a lot since 1992, and we've seen the inclusion of things like the social model of disability. However, the underpinning legislation and guidelines, both in 1992 and 2005, are using these outdated terminology, which we then are seeing throughout the whole policies and procedures throughout, from federal government all the way through to the university level. And we believe that that is actually connected to some of the other key findings as well. The second key finding was around this concept of the necessity to disclose. And what we found here, which we thought was quite interesting, is while people kept talking about this idea of this need to disclose, people were asking and talking about disclosing of personal information, but when you drill down through the data, what they were really asking for was to understand what all stakeholders needed to achieve a successful learning outcome. So people sometimes would talk about the need to disclose the disability. However, when you really drill down to the data set, what they were interested in was actually what do they need to do to support the person to succeed in their learning outcomes in the WIL experience. So we kind of unpacked and decided that this concept of disclosure can be repositioned a little bit, and to think a little bit more about disclosing supports for learning as opposed to actual disability and diagnosis data. Connected to that was the third finding, which was how we need to ensure that we use a strengths-based approach to inclusive and equitable WIL. And what we mean by that is that strengths-based approach needs to come all the way through from the legislation, but all the way through to the policies and procedures documents. And it's really important to note that a strengths-based approach does not mean you don't talk about gaps, issues, needs, all the areas for development. A strengths-based approach means that we talk about what is needed to ensure success, as opposed to pointing out deficits and barriers. And what we can see, and that was connected to Tanya's last point around this idea that we're teaching students not to disclose because it's seen as a burden, or it's seen as a negative, or something that is problematic. But if we talk about it in a strengths-based way, it actually creates more comfort in being open and honest about talking about what people need to assist in their learning. Then connected to that as well is this idea that the universities play a key role in ensuring this tripartisan relationship that Tanya was talking about. It is up to the universities to ensure that we're setting expectations and standards to support the relationship between the three stakeholder groups. And it's up to us to work with our student body to help to work with them to be open and honest about what they need for their learning and to ensure success in their learning. And then for us to work with the students about how do they then communicate that with the host organization. We could be working with our students to support them in developing up their own emails or their own communication systems, or asking them about what it is that they want to disclose to the organization and how that process should be. It's also up to us to then talk to our industry partners about how we actually support them in developing and hosting placements that are successful, which then leads on to our fifth key finding, which was that organizations are asking for resourcing. And part of this was about, there's a lot of language and terminology that is in legislation and disability policy and procedure that is very jargon heavy, and industry is not aware of what that means. So we need to help with translating some of that jargon to industry bodies, and to give them the confidence to know that they can actually do this as well. So the result of key finding number 5 was the development of our resources. So what we did with our resourcing is we went back to our host organizations and we went through all of the data from the literature review, the students and the host organizations, and we developed up a number of resources that we then took back to industry, and we asked 5 WIL providers to look at those resourcing documents and then provide us with some feedback on them. As part of the development of the resource documents, we also looked through and did a bit of an audit of the online disability training that's available, and that information is also in our report that's on the ACEN website. What we found when we did the audit of online training was there was some really good general information around what disability is, about having an employee who has a disability, but there wasn't a lot of resourcing that focused on students, and then focused on some of that real pragmatics about how we create equal and equitable learning opportunities for students with a disability. So that really, and that was a really clear need that the host organizations were asking us for as well. So we developed up the resources with the idea of helping guide the host organization to think about what do they need to do in preparation, what do they do at the starting point when a student starts, and then how do they support a student during the placement, and then also how do they evaluate whether or not it worked at the end of placement as well. So the first resource that we outlined, and we acknowledge that these slides, we just wanted to post what they actually look like. We do not expect you to be able to read these at all. All of these slides, all of these resources are available on the ACEN page. But I just wanted to talk very briefly through them. The first resource is about preparation and preparing for a student, or preparing for anyone to come on a wheel placement. What we did with the resource development is that we wanted to ensure, or what we heard from the student body is that they didn't want to be othered, and we don't want to actually create processes and procedures that are specific for people with disabilities. We want processes and procedures that are inclusive, that can be used across all student bodies. So we were really careful about the wording and the terminology that we used in the resourcing, so that host organizations can use these resources to prepare for any student. Because what we found and what we know is that we know some students do disclose and get reasonable adjustment plans. We know that some students don't understand or recognize or communicate what they need for their learning journey until they're out on placement. And that can cause some problems or challenges for their learning. So we really wanted to make sure that these resources were more of a universal in design. The host organizations were really clear in wanting check sheets and tick boxes. And we, again, the research team had some really clear discussions around this, because we didn't want it to be tokenistic. And we didn't want it to be that they could just tick a box that then meant that they've ticked all these boxes and they haven't necessarily implemented the strategy or the advice. So we were really careful with how we worded the questions in some of these check sheets that actually created the organization or motivated the organization to reflect on and consider a really specific action that they needed to take before they felt confident in ticking the box. So when you download the resource, you'll see that some of the questions are a little bit more open and require the organization to have a really good think about what they've got. The other part with the ticker box is that we didn't want to create a culture that they felt that they needed to tick all of the boxes before they felt they had the capacity to take on a student with a disability. So we've been really careful with the wording to say that these are some of the considerations you might want to think about, but you don't have to have all these in place before you are capable of taking a student with a disability. And we've also added a heap of extra supporting resources on that sheet as well. So then what we did was we developed up a series of questions to ask students, and we designed this, like I said before, that that some questions that the host organization can ask the student before they come out on placement, some of the questions that they can ask during the placement, and then some questions that they can ask the student post-placement. And again, these questions we designed to be really broad and open, that the host organization can really ask any student, not necessarily students who they know have a disability or not. And yeah, I think that's enough on that slide. Thanks, Tanya. And part of that resource as well is that we had a few hints and tips. Again, the industry was looking for a few hints and tips about how they can support students. And these dot points that we developed up here are again to try and guide the host organization about how do you create an environment that feels safe for everybody to ask and to talk about what they need to support their learning while on placement. Then our final resource was a series of case studies. Now, the case studies were explicitly asked for by the industry partners. And I just wanted to reiterate that while we focused on health students throughout this whole project, the first three resources are fairly general enough that it would be interesting to see what other industry partners thought of those questions. And we did test it with some industry partners that weren't necessarily health oriented. So with our work integrated learning program that Tanya runs, while they're health-based students, they do go out to some other industries like business or community development organizations. So we did have a variety of organizations that looked at some of these resources. we would be really interested to hear from the community about how applicable and how transferable some of these resources are across industry. But the case studies are specific to health student scenarios. And again, would be interested to hear about how people felt they would translate if we change the scenarios just slightly. But the main purpose of the case scenarios is that industry partners, to help understand some of the jargon and help translate some of that jargon, to give them some really clear ideas of what reasonable adjustments are or what they might look like, and to give some ideas about what the scenario might look like, and then what the capacity and the resources are of the universities to help guide and support the the industry partner to host a student with a disability. Did you have anything else to add to that, Tanya?
No, I think you've done a good job.
So, so again, all of those resources are online, and I just wanted to briefly hand over to Roz to summarise our presentation and then lead us in a few questions.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Tom. That was really a good summary of the resources, even in a short amount of time. But I think it's fair to say that we all are very aware that WIL is a great opportunity for situated learning for students, and we need to make sure that our conversations and our language are, provide the same sort of opportunity for students with a disability as well. And universities and host organisations, and that communication that happens between those two groups are critical to ensure that students with disability can maximise the work integrated learning opportunities that are actually on offer. So we've obviously focused a lot on host organisations today, but there, as Tanya suggested, we do have quite a few publications that are coming out, and one of those is around the student experience, which we'll make available on the ACEN website as they become available too. But from today's presentations, we thought we would share with you 4 recommendations or take-home messages that you can consider going forward. So the first one is about higher education institutions review, improve and monitor their current practices and policies to ensure WIL coordinators, host organisations and supervisors engage collaboratively to provide students with disability safe and equitable WIL experiences. So really what this is saying, there needs to be a planned protocol of action to ensure that there's this sort of consistency. It builds the longevity of change into this process, and it becomes far more integrated than what we have seen from the evidence that's been gathered in this research. So, for instance, if a staff member unexpectedly has to leave, you know, is there an ability for a smooth transition between placement supervisors to take over and ensure that students with a disability have their support continued, and some of those protocols that are embedded will ensure that can actually happen. The second recommendation is universities to advocate for changes to legislation relating to disability, including the 1992 Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Standards for Education, to include a more contemporary definition that considers the social perspective of disability. So really it's saying that universities do have a responsibility to advocate for these changes, as they are currently quite outdated, and they need to reflect more of a social perspective where there's barriers in society, not just for the infrastructure things like having accessible toilets, but it's also about these assumptions that can sit behind decisions that are made for students with a disability about perceived limitations. And we need to address this by engaging more with students and adopting a more strengths-based approach to look at how we can support students with a disability. The third recommendation is around higher education institutions updating their WIL policies and procedures to consider students with a disability. So with this in mind, I perhaps want to say that we need to do this with a sense of urgency from a university's perspective, because nothing much has changed in the last 20 years, and we would hope that the next decade would see a dramatic shift in the language that we're embedding in those policies, and particularly in the procedures as well, and in the training that's required to support supervisors from a university perspective. And the final recommendation is the host organisations utilise the resources developed as part of this project to enhance their knowledge, capacity and capabilities to provide students with disability an equitable, safe and a meaningful experience. And you can utilise all of the brains trust, if you like, of effort that went into the development of those resources and the consideration of the language that's used as important resources to help get a conversation happening at your university to make those required changes. So embedding information resources also into your procedures and policy will support new people coming in who are supervising student placements, actually being able to access resources that support that process as well, and obviously support a social model of support for people with a disability. So as Tom suggested, we've got, we do have a slide up of the team. Sorry, Tanya, I forgot about that one. Where you feel free to reach out to any of the team members, and the different team members obviously worked a little bit more on different aspects of this project. So the publications will actually give you some ideas about who to contact for some of the different questions you may have as well. But Tanya's obviously, as the project lead, she's made herself available to reach out if you have any further questions as well. So I just wanted to open up to any questions that may have come about from the content that we have today before I go on to ask some specific questions and to get your feedback in the chat, if that's okay. So I just want to know, does anyone have any questions they would like to pose to Tanya, Tom or myself?
Hi, it's Jonathan here from RMIT Uni. How you going?
Good, Jonathan. How are you?
Excellent, thank you. I actually missed a little bit of the presentation, sorry, and this might have been addressing that point, but I'm wondering what work in terms of your study and your advice is being doing rather than the industry side, but the student side.
So Tanya, do you want to respond to that?
Sorry, Jonathan, what were you, could you repeat your question, please?
So around being able to provide students with information and education around sharing of information and being able to seek those adjustments in the workplace as well, because you like I said, you can only do as good as that knowledge of disability that you have, but they may not disclose to you or the university. But just wondering if that sort of information is being passed on to students or provided to students as well.
Students can have access to this. I think we need possibly a separate set of resources and training for the students. And that's really another project to look at and how to do that. And because that needs to be a little bit more nuanced, I guess. And also, as Tom mentioned before, encouraging, if you like, in terms of what does disclosure mean? What are people really asking, as Tom discussed? And it's okay to say that you may need this. And as one of the host organisations said, all students will need something while they're on WIL, regardless. They're not experts at everything, and they will need some assistance in something. So it's, I think, for us, the universities and the organisations, to share that sort of message will help the students. But in response to your question, I think we need specifics, more specialised resources for the students themselves.
Can I also just add to that too, because it's a really interesting question, Jonathan. And I'm just reviewing our student feedback paper that we did as well, and the students are like, they want to disclose and they're quite happy to talk through things. It's the data that we collected really spoke to a fear of when they do disclose that it actually then gets used against them. And I think that's part of the reason why we really focused on the host organizations, because I think again, this takes in that more social model of disability approach too, where we shouldn't necessarily be asking students with a disability to be modifying or changing their own behaviors or doing the work on themselves necessarily. We need to actually think about what's happening in the environments and how things are being used against them for it's not quite the right words I'm looking for, but what we saw in the student data and what we heard from the student stories is that when they did disclose, often their disclosure then was used against them, and it made them feel like they were even more disabled, more impaired, and they were then treated really differently, which then again speaks to Tanya's quote where they're being trained to actually stop disclosing. So it's not that they don't want to, they actually are prepared to do it. It's just when they do it, the adverse effects have been pretty detrimental. And it was, I kind of can't wait for this paper to come out, because some of the stories were pretty harrowing that we heard from the students, and it was quite distressing to actually hear a lot of their stories. And I just want briefly just speak to your other question that you put online too, Jonathan, which I thought was another great question, about the barriers and the support. So I think what we also found was that a number of students didn't know what was necessarily needed until they got out into the workforce. And I think that to me, that's really exciting, because that's the whole essence of WIL. That's why we do it, is because we're actually training the students and we're training them to figure out what is it that they need to actually lead a successful work life. And some of the stories, again, we heard, some of the successful stories we heard was all about how when they did go out, they actually started understanding who they were as a worker and what do they need to be a learner and a worker. And then when they had good communication with the students, with the organization and with the universities, we saw success. And I think that speaks to this strengths-based approach. When people had a successful disclosure, a successful discussion around learning needs, and that was well supported and then not used in a punitive way, it was a win for everybody. But that kind of is a bit of the rarity from the data set that we collected.
Thanks very much, Tom. Does that answer your question, Jonathan? And more, I would imagine.
Yeah, in part. Yeah, absolutely. So my role at RMIT is a careers consultant for students with disability. So a part of my role is not only, I suppose, the rare sort of everyday career sort of stuff, but also assisting with WIL, and so helping develop guidelines for students and WIL staff and organisations as well. So and I think that, like you said, that it is a career management skill, and that's the fantastic thing about the WIL opportunity. And I suppose a follow-up question to the advice that you've been doing, again, I might have missed it, but are you actually asking the question of industry when you're reaching out to, would you be interested in engaging with some of our equitable and diverse cohort? So you are starting to identify some places you might be able to work closely with?
Yeah, we're starting to do that and putting in place, when you go for a job advert, it'll say that this is an inclusive environment to work in, right?
Starting to lose as many a bit.
Yeah. And so what we're going to start, particularly for my WIL, and I know Tom, as we talked about that the other day as well, is actually having that on. For the WIL that I look after, we advertise on Career Hub. And so the student will have that information that it is an inclusive workplace. It has these facilities there. It could be a non-sensory room, or it has wheelchair access, or, braille keyboard, or all those sort of things. So that can actually help, in particular for my unit, students, they choose the internship they'd like to go on or apply for it. So that will help them from that perspective. But for our other disciplines, having that information on our in place will actually help the staff and our team in the placement team help allocate students where we know, there is a need. So yes, we're starting to do that. And yeah.
Thanks so much, Tanya, and Tom, for helping out answering the question for Jonathan. So I can see we've probably got a couple more minutes, Jennifer, if that's okay with you. We can put a few questions out to the group, because what we did find when we did the desktop review is that it's obviously only accessing information that's publicly available, and this is a great forum to try and get some insights into what happens at your university. So we would really like it if you could respond to these questions. We've got 3 questions coming up into the chat, and you can provide as little or as much detail as you would like to. And tell us about what processes you currently have at your university to ensure there is safe and equitable will for students with disability. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to jot down those in the chat, if you can, please.
Ros, while people are taking the time there, I might just share a take-home learning that we've applied in occupational therapy while people are generating that chat. Following this, we ask our students in occupational therapy to fill in a placement characteristic form. So we ask our students what kind of placement experience they would like to do in occupational therapy, and because in our process, we need to allocate the students to make sure they meet accreditation standards. And what we're going to do, we haven't done it yet, but what we will be doing is to include a question in that characteristics format to talk about, is there anything that the student wants us to know that will support them in their learning? And in that question, what we will do is open up, just have a few examples around a few ideas that we're looking for, and that's going to include things like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, LGBTQI+, if there's any additional learning needs or learning supports that they would like in place. But to have it as a really general open-ended question to just hopefully support the student in writing what they think will actually help their learning. And by having it as an online survey, we're hoping that the students are feeling again safe enough that they can then disclose or communicate with us about something that they're potentially fearful about their placement, or that they think might help them with their placement as well.
A great recommendation, Tom. Yeah, that's really good. And thanks. I can see people starting to add their comments into the chat. So much appreciated. So I might just jump to the next question if I can, please, Tanya. Thank you. And if you could share what has worked to successfully engage students with disability and will, if there is any tips or techniques that you found at your university, that would be wonderful. So we can give a couple of minutes. Any insights there, Tom?
I think I can just tap into again, and I'm sure Tanya's got a heap as well. Just reiterate a bit of what Jonathan was talking about there is the importance of having the regular check-ins with your students. So we've found that if we provided an opportunity for the students, whether it's on the learning platform discussion board, or we did some online virtual check-ins, and clear communication with the students about how they can contact us to let us know about how they're progressing. Similarly, we send out a reminder or an email to the host organizations as well, just to get a feel about how the student is progressing through their placement experience. And I think because, again, like Jonathan said in his original question, a lot of the students don't, it's their first experience in the workplace, and they may or may not know what's available, how learning can be supported in work. And this is kind of their first practice at being a particular health professional or being a professional in any manner. So it is kind of like a trial by error. And we had a few students who actually talked about in their interview, and they talked about how it was when things were open and flexible and they felt supported, that they felt that they could take the risk, that they could experiment and try different things that will help them to achieve their learning outcomes. And it really was. And I think that's the beauty of will. Like, I really think that's a fantastic component.
Thanks, Tom. That's fabulous. And the last question is, what are the pain points when engaging students with disability and will? Because if we obviously need to get a sense of where there are some gaps, where we need to do some additional work, perhaps where there needs to be additional resourcing to support that as well. So it would be great to hear your insights on that for everyone who's listening to the session today. And Tanya, would you like to share anything, or Tom, around that point?
I guess from my perspective, the pain point was really with the host organisations and them not being willing to put in place things for students with disability. And that's why we came up with this study. And it's to encourage them that they can do this, that it's, you know, that these are the tools to do it in a strengths-based way. So I think for me, with the for the non-clinical will students, which that's probably the main thing that has challenged me, and the lack of understanding of what is needed for a student, you know, and deciding to take a student on, but realizing that they're on the second floor and the student's on crutches, and it's what happens in an emergency type thing. So it's the education, I think, of the host organisations. I know that's really quite I'm passionate about, and I understand the questions regarding the students, and I think that's what we need to do for the students. And I think that is something that, you know, we do need some resources that we can share around to help them as well understand this. But yeah, that's my main pain points at the moment, Ros.
Thanks very much, Tanya. So I'm just mindful of the time. I think we've come to our 1 hour scheduled time. And on behalf of this project team, I'd like to thank ACEN very much for the opportunity to be able to present our findings today. And also I'd welcome any communication, you know, to the team if you have any additional questions or insights that you would like to share. And we hope you've enjoyed our presentation today. So thank you very much for joining us. And I'll hand it back to Jennifer now.
Thanks so much, Ros. And thank you, Tanya and Tom, as well. And also to the participants for engaging in this very exciting but very necessary work that is going to create not only good resources for all of us working in higher education, but also for projects in the future. So look around you, here are your collaborators, and you know, take this, continue this work and take it forward into its next space, because it's incredibly necessary. So I thank you again for being part of the ACEN Research Conversations, and have a lovely afternoon and a restful Easter break.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.